Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So we are continuing our series on sacrifice zones. And like I said last week, we are in the middle of a sub-series on Cancer Alley. So last week we talked about EPA's lawsuit against Dinka and DuPont, two industries in Cancer Alley. And I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode just to get a brief idea about what's going on in that lawsuit. But today, we're going to start from the beginning on Cancer Alley. We're going to think through and understand more about how Cancer Alley came to be, because there is so much that needs to be said and so much that Cancer Alley can teach us about the insidious nature of environmental racism in our country and around the world. So on this episode, we're going to start from the beginning and talk about Cancer Alley. Where is it? How did it become Cancer Alley? And what can we learn from Cancer Alley? So that's what we're talking about in this episode. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for listening. Today's episode is about Cancer Alley. We're going to continue our discussion about Cancer Alley. Last week was talking about the lawsuits that the EPA filed against Dinka and DuPont. But on this episode, I want us to begin from the beginning with Cancer Alley, get a sense of where it is, what it is, and how it came to be. And so let's just start from the beginning. Just so you know, Cancer Alley is commonly understood to be this 85-mile-long stretch along the Mississippi River from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. And the last number that I saw said that between 150 and 200 petrochemical plants and refineries are located on this stretch between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And Cancer Alley there's about 45,000 people that live along this stretch, the majority of whom are Black and African American. And to understand why that is, you have to go back to the beginning. So let's do a little background check on Cancer Alley. So right now, much of Cancer Alley, that stretch of land, is rural and is unincorporated. Unincorporated means that it's not actually included as part of any particular city. And so because it's outside of city limits, like you might say, it's not included in any particular city governance structure. All of the decisions that are made on Cancer Alley are made by elected officials on the county level. So people in that county decide what happens in these areas. And so because of that, you have this area where people who are primarily African American, low income, are represented by more affluent white elected officials that don't live anywhere near where they live. And that's happened because of the history of this area. So the main reason why you have this stretch of land occupied by Black residents is because prior to it being Cancer Alley, it was commonly known as plantation country because of the large number of slaves that were working the sugarcane fields in these areas back in the 1800s. So we know that along the river, there's always very fertile land. And along the river is usually a great place to farm and to grow crops and to do a lot of agriculture. And so during slavery, plantations were built all along this stretch of land, and slaves were forced to work the fields, getting sugar cane and building the economy for this part of the country. And so that was how so many African Americans were located in this area, because they were brought there as slaves to work the field. But once slavery ended, the freed slaves stayed in that area and tried to build a life off the land. They tried to survive off of what they knew and understood. And so they stayed where they were and sought to build a life there. Now, if you Google plantation country, Louisiana, you might not get that story. You might get a more glowing picture of the regal and the magnificent historic architecture that represented that area. And you'll see pictures of these huge houses, nice lush green areas, and you'll get a sense that this is the kind of majestic place that people would love to live in. And so right now it is a very big tourist attraction to bring people to Louisiana and to encourage them to get a taste of vintage Louisiana. And I'll just be honest. This is not part of the episode, but I have a big problem with plantation tourism. I call it plantation tourism or slavery tourism. This idea that you'll take something that happened that was so vicious and so horrible in the past, memorialize it where it stood, and continue to profit off of it by encouraging people to come and visit, take pictures, have events on these plantations where enslaved people were mistreated and harmed, supporting this horrible institution that we know as chattel slavery. So I'm from South Carolina. So in Charleston, a lot of plantation tourism, a lot of come look at these homes that slaves were forced to live in, and look at these places where people abused fellow citizens for profit and gain because of how they look. Please come and visit and enjoy. And so it happens a lot in South Carolina where I'm from, and based on these articles that I've seen on plantation country, it happens a lot in Louisiana too. And it's just unfortunate. And so now plantation country has become Cancer Alley. And so the question is, well, how did that happen? How did you get from a place where enslaved Africans become free in a nice area along the river, which then becomes this dumping ground and this breeding ground for just more and more industry and more pollution and contamination? And so I did some digging, and I saw that the first time this word was used, it was used to describe one single street called Jacob Street. I couldn't find the city where it was located, but there's an article where they quote somebody as saying that Jacob Street is Cancer Alley. And the idea was that there was one oil refinery on this street, and people who lived on that street near that oil refinery seem to be dying from cancer more than other places. The article that I found quotes this person as saying, I know at least 12 people who died of cancer on this street. And I know 5 people who have cancer now who live on that street. And so they called that street Cancer Alley. So basically, you're okay. If you come down this street, you're going to get exposed to chemicals and contamination that's going to cause cancer. And it became known as that for that street. But then from there, it just grew and grew, right? So more companies came, more plants got built, more emissions were dumped on the people living along this river. And then one street became 2 streets, became a neighborhood, became a parish, became several parishes. And all along the Mississippi River, from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, we fill this area with plants and facilities that pollute and pollute and pollute. And I can see why a company want to come here. There's lots of reasons why a chemical manufacturer would want to have their facility along this river. So for one, the Mississippi River offers easy access to some of the busiest shipping lanes across the country, right? I mean, it's a big river. You can bring your boats in, you have access, you can travel along, distribute your product. And so it makes it very advantageous if you're trying to produce and distribute your products to have your facility along this river. And of course, another reason why they would be interested is because the land was cheaper. Of course, the land was cheaper because Black people lived on it, and their land has always been devalued. And because of the way that the system is set up around real estate and the way that redlining and the way that housing and land use was done early on as our country was built, you relegated certain communities to certain parts of a town or certain parts of a city, and then those parts of the city dropped in value. And so because of that, it's cheaper to build on this land and easier to obtain it for your company's purposes. And so that's another reason why you'd want to come. Cheap land, the river's right there. And don't forget, the people who live there are not incorporated. So they don't have a say in what happens on their land. those decisions are made by elected officials at the county level somewhere else. And these officials don't represent the small working class majority Black communities that you would find along Cancer Alley. They don't live there. They don't work there. They don't know anybody that is there. When they make decisions, they're not thinking about those aspects. And so typically when you have an unincorporated area, what's supposed to happen is that the elected officials would look at their zoning laws, their planning practices, and they would do things in a way that would protect people's health, their safety, and their general well-being, because they can't do it themselves. They don't have the ability to vote and to dictate what happens there. You've been elected to protect everyone. But that didn't happen, did it? What actually happened was they kept these polluting industries from settling in majority white neighborhoods around the state and around their county, and they funneled them to the Black communities along the river. And so one after another, plant after plant, facility after facility, kept coming and coming and coming and coming. And because the people had no representation in their local governments because they were unincorporated, they had no protection against these industries coming. And because the state regulators and because the state as a whole was encouraging this kind of investment and this kind of construction, they continued to breathe in more and more of these toxic emissions as these industries grew. And let's not forget, you may not know this, but government officials love industries at every level. City officials love industries. State officials love industries. County officials love industries. They love them because when they see an industry coming, they believe that progress is being made. We have revenues coming in. We have jobs being created. We have activity in our state, in our city. Isn't it so great to have them here? We're so excited about that. And they'll even relax the regulations to encourage them to come. So usually when you want people to come to your state, you relax tax laws, right? So you say you don't have to worry about property taxes, corporate taxes. We'll waive those to make it economically beneficial for you to come here. And because you come here, people work there, and people who are working there will pay their taxes, and that's how we can justify having this industry around. But what they also do with these types of industries, because they're polluters, they relax the environmental regulations too. And the environmental protections that are in place to keep us safe, those laws also get relaxed. And so now not only do you get tax benefits, you get regulatory relief as you come in, you build, and you pollute. And so Louisiana will say that they have standards for toxic chemicals and emissions around the plants. But what it doesn't do is monitor the air around the neighborhoods that are adjacent to these plants. They don't have the monitors that they need at the schools, at the other businesses, in the residential neighborhoods that would help show that people who live near these facilities are not being overly burdened by their activities. Even Texas does that. Texas is the big state next door. They do that. They monitor the plants and the neighboring areas. And Texas loves the industry like everybody else does. But they've even kept that in place while Louisiana has foregone it to encourage these industries to come and to build in this same area. And another thing that Louisiana does, which is so unfortunate. So when you look at the EPA and their analysis of how they determine cancer risks and how they decide who should be where, they look at the cumulative effect of what's happening in those areas to determine the risk to the individuals that live there. That's what they do. That's what we should all do. Because if you live in a certain area, you're not just exposed to one thing, you're exposed to all the things. But Louisiana, they take a different approach. They look at one chemical at a time and one plant at a time. They look at them individually. And so that's another problem that perpetuates the continued expansion of the activities on Cancer Alley. And just keep in mind, all of these facilities are in the same location. It's not as though we have these kinds of industrial activities all across Louisiana. That's not happening. It's all concentrated in this one area. And it's all along this river where the black people live, and they keep coming and they keep coming. And the justification for this is always jobs. It's always jobs. It's economic. The idea that they're bringing jobs. People living in those poor areas. You said they were poor. They needed some income, some relief. These facilities will come and provide that. You can get a job. We can have activities. So the businesses that serve the industries can also be built around them and create this whole kind of ecosystem of employment and economic vitality along this stretch where people are in need of this kind of support. That's always the justification, isn't it? That's always what we're made to believe is the reason for these investments in these communities. A couple of things. First of all, it's just not true. It's not true. There's been research done. So the Journal of Organization and Environment has a study in it where they surveyed 11 plants in the St. James Parish. And they found that in this parish, you have 49% African American population that lives there. But at these plants, they only employ between 5 and 20% of African Americans. So clearly, the people who live there aren't getting those jobs. And the people getting those jobs don't live there. They drive in, they work, they go home outside of Cancer Alley. So the idea that you're bringing jobs to the community, it's not true. It's just not true. Second, I haven't spoken to anybody about this, but I would imagine that people who live in this area don't want to work at these facilities. They're not thanking the government for sending these industries to their area so they can have a chance to get a job at one of them. They don't want these polluting facilities around them at all. Like I said, I haven't spoken to anybody about that, but I would imagine that they would much rather have no plants, no facilities that pollute and dump toxic chemicals on them than to have a chance to work at one of these facilities that does. Think about it. If you walked up to a Cancer Alley resident and you said, "Excuse me, sir, I understand you're unemployed. Would you rather have a job at this DuPont plant, or would you rather this DuPont plant not be here?" I bet they would choose the second option. I would, because I can't think of a job or an industry that's worth your life and the lives of your family and friends and community where you live. I just can't imagine that. So what we have here in Cancer Alley is a long stretch along the Mississippi River inhabited by predominantly African Americans who continually see industries and quote unquote investment being made in their communities that they don't benefit from, but that they bear the environmental weight of as they operate. And so that is the tragedy of Cancer Alley. And that is why it is the textbook case study on environmental racism and injustice. Because you're taking a marginalized group of people who don't have the resources to push back, and you're sending all of the most polluting industries their way, dumping it on them, and extracting from them their health and well-being for other parts of the state to profit. It's just awful. And so when I think about that, I have to ask myself, well, is there anything we can learn from Cancer Alley? What can I take away from thinking about just the idea that there is a such thing as a Cancer Alley? And so a couple things came to my mind. One, the legacy of slavery endures. I know that's not very popular sentiment. People want to move past slavery and move past the trauma and the pain that slavery inflicted on a group. But this goes beyond just emotional and psychological damage from generation to generation. This is literally byproducts of the institution of slavery in Louisiana. Remember, Cancer Alley used to be plantation country, where enslaved Africans worked to build economic strength in this area. And now, since they've been freed from slavery, guess what? They're being exploited, and I would argue enslaved, in a different way, by being dumped on in the worst ways imaginable, continually, over and over. This legacy has continued in this area. The second thing I would say is that polluting industries will always find the marginalized minority communities in their areas and dump on them. They will. Look, Louisiana is a big state. It's not as big as Texas, not as big as California, but it's big. But why are all of these industries so concentrated in this small portion of the state? You could say it's because of the river. Maybe. But that river is huge and it goes far beyond Cancer Alley. So why are they all right there? Right? It started as one company on one street, Jacob Street, and now it's 85 miles of pure, unmitigated, unhindered, toxic contamination that is being just poured out on these people. Why is that? I would argue it's because these industries will find those areas. They will find those pockets. They will find the places to dump. So whenever you hear about an oil company, a gas company, some type of polluting industry looking for a place to have their operations, say no. Just say no, because they're going to find the marginalized groups and harm them even further. They're not going to end up in the suburbs. They're not going to end up in the urban areas where people are working and having their businesses and playing. They're going to find those pockets of marginalized, minority, immigrant, rural, whatever word you want to use. In this case, it's African American, and they will put their industries there. And Cancer Alley is a clear indication of that. You would think there's no more room for more industry, but they keep finding locations, finding more. They want to build more, expand more, because they're going to find those areas. And the last thing I want to say about it is that the world is watching. The world is watching Cancer Alley. It's actually very interesting. And it's happening in two different ways. So one, the United Nations has taken notice of Cancer Alley. I'm going to put a link in the description, but the human rights experts at the United Nations have spoken out against Cancer Alley. The United Nations, way over in Switzerland, saw Cancer Alley and said, oh, we got to say something about this. That's how bad it is. This is some of the quotes from their article condemning Cancer Alley. They say the further industrialization of so-called Cancer Alley in the southern United States, known for its pollution-emitting chemical plants, should be halted. This is according to a large group of independent UN human rights experts who branded it a form of environmental racism. That's what the UN is saying. They went on. This form of environmental racism poses serious and disproportionate threats to the enjoyment of several human rights to its largely African American residents, including the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to life, the right to health, the right to an adequate standard of living, and cultural rights. That's what they're saying. Think about that for a second. The UN said that about a section in the United States of America. I don't think anybody in the US would ever think that the United States would be identified by the UN as having a part of its country condemned for human rights violations. But that's what they're saying. This is the UN. The UN talks about genocides. They talk about persecuting religious groups around the world. They talk about killing journalists in certain authoritarian regimes. They talk about unprovoked wars of aggression. They deal with fallout from massive environmental disasters. And they're talking about Cancer Alley. So we have to think about that for a second, that we live in a place where the UN is talking about a place in America that's supposed to be representing the best of what it means to be free and human and to flourish. That's what's happening. And I'll say this, on the other side, you have the industries around the world watching. They're watching and they see Cancer Alley and they say, oh, okay, we can put our plants over there in America. We can put our plants right there with the rest of them. They don't seem to care. They don't have regulations that are keeping us from going there. They don't have the structures and the oversight that some of these other countries have that we want to go to. Let's go to Cancer Alley. They don't call it Cancer Alley. There are other countries. They'll just say, let's go over to America and let's get our plants there. They're going to love us over there. And we'll just put them with the rest of them because there doesn't seem to be any issues with doing that. So they're watching. We'll have to think about how many foreign-owned companies are in Cancer Alley right now. How many organizations and how many manufacturers from other countries find themselves in Cancer Alley, Louisiana. Why is that? I mean, we're just getting started on Cancer Alley, right? So next week, we're going to dive into the very specific health impacts that people who live in Cancer Alley experience. And we're going to look at the research that makes the connection. This is very important. there's research that makes the connection between these industries and these health issues. Because for so long, these industries have been saying, no, you can't say that we're the cause of that. You can't pin that on us. We're not the reason people are getting sick this way. But there has been recent research that's come out that demonstrates that that is the case. We're going to talk about that next week. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. We are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.